Hey, how's it going? My name is Tom and you're watching Adventure Films. In this video I want to talk to you about the basics of photography. I've already made a video like this where I explain everything in 120 seconds. But if that video is too fast for you, or you just want to hear me talk about photography and the basics and how you shoot a manual photo, then just, feel free to join. So when you shoot a photo, you're obviously dealing with light that's coming into the lens, and this light has to be controlled, and you control that by the time that the light can reach the sensor in the back of your camera, and you can control that with the amount of light. When you have like a lens and it's open this large, there's a lot of light coming through, but if the lens is only open this tiny, and then there's not much light coming through. And so this is how you can play around with the light that you have given. So if you have bright daylight, there's so much light coming in, and if you have nighttime, there's obviously no light coming in. And so this is what you have to think about when shooting manually. Now to the settings. You've got 3 settings that you want to be thinking of, which is the shutter speed, which controls the time. You've got aperture, which controls the opening, and you've got the ISO, which I didn't talk about yet. This is all about how bright the sensor is gonna render the image that you are shooting, so the sensor can electronically brighten up the image. The most obvious thing you can control is not the ISO, but it's more likely what you can hear when you do a photo. It's that click that you always hear. And what actually does make the click is the shutter speed, because there's a shutter going past inside of the camera that is going past the sensor and opens the sensor to the light for a fraction of a second or even longer, however you want to set it. And so this is how you can think of how a shutter works. It can be very fast and there's only like a fraction of a second light coming through the lens onto the sensor, but it could be very long too. So if you want to do night photography, you'll be setting your camera on a tripod, and then you can open up the sensor for like 30 seconds or so. So the shutter speed determines the time of how long the sensor is open to the light. Next up is the aperture. So the aperture is most often inside of the lens. I have no idea when it's not in the lens, but in the lens you have not only glass where the light is coming in, but you have an aperture. And an aperture is pretty much a ring of blades that just closes to like a very tiny hole or opens up to like a huge hole. So the aperture is this little tiny ring of blades inside of the lens, and it can be very tiny and it can be very big. Depending on that, there's lots of light coming through or just a little amount of light. This obviously can play with the time that the sensor is open to the light from the shutter speed. You can think of the aperture being the first layer where the light is coming through, because the light comes through the lens, passes the aperture, and the aperture decides first how much light is coming through towards the shutter speed, and then the shutter determines how much of that massive amount of light or like just small amount of light is getting cut off towards the sensor. And on the third layer you will have the ISO, because the sensor is gonna process the light that hit the sensor, and it can either make it more bright or more dim. Yeah, so ISO, the last layer, really determines how bright you want to render out the image, but ISO can only help you out with a small degree, because ISO introduces noise into your image when you bump it up too much, and you're always better off having the ISO as low as possible. With most cameras you're good to a certain degree, for example 800 ISO or 1600 or 3200, maybe even 6400, I have no idea. I've only had one camera and it passes out at 1600, so I always try and only go to 800, because it introduces so much noise when you're going higher than 800 or 1600, which is some cameras are better and some are worse, but it really is just the camera bringing more brightness digitally to the image. So now that we have spoken about the basic principles of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, and how it all works together, that the aperture is the first layer that the light is passing through, then coming towards the shutter speed and the ISO, and then you have the final image. You always really want an image that is very pleasing to look at, so you don't want it too bright or too low, which basically means you have to dial in the kind of perfect settings for the image. Obviously you have a viewfinder and you can see how much light is coming through. Most often it even has a light meter, built inside, so it actually will tell you how bright the image overall is or how dark it is and what could be the perfect exposure, which is always that little thing down in the middle where it says plus or minus. So when it's just on plus minus 0, then you basically have the perfect image, but that's not always the case because you want to watch out for what you want to be exposing at. That's a whole different story really, because we only want to be focusing not on the display and what you can see out there, but really on the settings that you can dial in for your camera. But the light meter can help you out a little bit to see how good your exposure is. It's only like a rough guideline, you know? For the last bit of the video, if you want to be dialing in the right settings, you have to know what settings you are adjusting. So you have the shutter speed, which is expressed in seconds. So you can either have the shutter open for 60 seconds, for 3 seconds, for 1 second, for 1/50th of a second, or even for 1/8000th of a second. And so for a rough guideline, when you shoot sport, for example, you want to freeze the motion and have everything razor sharp and not blurry. You want to be going for the highest shutter speed your camera is capable of. So 1/6000th of a second or even 1/8000th of a second is gonna do that really well, because it's such a tiny amount of time, and yeah, you'll be surprised what you can actually get with that and have it razor sharp. So that's pretty cool. When you shoot something handheld, no stabilizer or no tripod, because on tripod you can go for longer, but if you shoot handheld, you want to be having the shutter speed of roughly 1/50th of a second or 1/60th of a second, because otherwise your shaking hands will introduce blurriness to the image, which you don't want. And so in daylight you can go 1/100th of a second, that will be pretty safe. That's all up to you. I'm just saying these are some rough guidelines. So handheld 1/60th of a second or higher, it's pretty good. And if you want to go lower and shoot night photography, you might want to be, you know, finding yourself something to rest your camera on, or just lay it flat on the ground. You could have your camera on top of a tripod like I have right now, which is all stable, and then you could, you know, shoot the stars for like 60 seconds. A tip here is you can set a timer before, 2 seconds before you take the image, and then it will go for 60 seconds, because in those 60 seconds you don't want your camera to move at all, otherwise you have those light strokes and all, yeah, completely blurred out image. If you want that, that's cool, but you know, if you want to have a crisp image of the stars or like the scenery, don't move your camera at all. And so set a timer, so otherwise the pressing of your shutter could actually lead to some, you know, unwanted blurriness in your picture. But that's pretty much for the shutter speed, measured in seconds, and is the time that the light comes in. And you know that we have on the first layer, we've got the aperture, which is the ring of blades, expressed in the f-stop. So the f-stop determines how wide open or closed the aperture is. You know that ring of blades we were talking about? How much light is coming through. It can get very tiny, and that is called a high f-stop, and could be like f22, and I think that's even the maximum that you can go. You can just barely see through probably with your own eye. And so when that ring of blades is closed, the f-stop is high. Remember that, it's high, and it's called like f22, for example. You can have like a medium closed aperture, which is like f11. It's only like half open pretty much. And then you have the very wide open, which is a very low f-stop, but it's an open aperture. You know, when the ring of blades is very open, the most amount of light is able to come through, you have a very low f-stop then, which can be 1.7 or 2.8. So when the number of the f-stop is very low, that means a lot of light can come through. So much to that. The scale of the aperture is measured in the f-stop, and it can reach from very close, f22, to very wide open, f0.95, I think that is. A very nice thing that the f-stop does is to control the depth of field in your image. And by depth of field, I mean the focus area of what you're shooting at. So basically, for me right now, the focus area would be something like from my face to just behind me. But the window behind me, for example, wouldn't be in focus right now. So you have the focus area of myself. And what's funny about the f-stop is that when you have a very high f-stop for like f22, everything will be in focus from the very front to the very back. And so you have a huge focus area. For example, when you have like a house and then you have backgrounds and mountains in the very back, and the house will be in focus and the mountains in the back will be in focus and everything will be in focus, pretty much. It's not going to be that extreme, but it's a lot extreme. Trying to explain depth of field is really not that easy, you know, like, but you can think of it like when you pull the focus, this focus area, when you pull the focus towards the camera, will come towards the camera, and when you go back, it'll go back. So if the focus is here, I'll be in focus here. And so before I said f/22 will give you that huge focus area, and if you have like an f/1.7, it will give you a very small focus area. So it can be very small. Like some cameras or photos are that extreme that you can even have the eyes in focus and the tip of your nose will be out of focus a little bit. So that's pretty crazy. It's like razor thin, the depth of field or the focused area. Think of that when you're buying like a lens, because the more open the aperture is, so the lower the f-stop is, the thinner the shallow depth of field will get, but it will also make your background very blurry, which is what you want for Instagram or for any other photos, because it will always look cinematic and more pleasing when you have like a blurred out background, because the focus obviously is on the subject. Like on me, hopefully. To sum things up, the f-stop can go from very closed f/22 to very open f/1.7, and when it's wide open you have a very shallow depth of field or a shallow focus area, which will be from here to here maybe. And when the f-stop is closed and you have a high f-stop for example f/22, your focus area or your depth of field will be huge. And that's something you can play around, because it's quite fun to shoot like things that are, you know, have like something in focus and something out of focus, and that's something you want to be trying out when you shoot photo before you're getting into film, so you know what to do when you're shooting film. The same principle will work for film, but now you can just test it with photos. Isn't that cool? Coming now to the ISO. I've been talking about that one before, but ISO is written in ISO pretty much, and it can range from 100 to crazy high, like 128,000, I think, not sure, but it goes up like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400 and so on. Most cameras are like capable from shooting like 100 or 200 to 3200. And the lower the ISO is, the less noise it will introduce and the less bright the image will be. That's pretty much everything I know about ISO. Everything I talked about is pretty much out of my memory right now, so don't put me on anything I talked about. To have that coming straight off my mind is pretty crazy, because I've been doing that a lot lately in the last couple of years. Taking photos, taking videos. You have to learn it if you want to be taking serious videos or photos. You want to be knowing the basics of photography, which is everything we talked about in this video. Shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And all that together forms the image. What I can say, to sum things up, when you want to be exposing an image, you've got your ISO, you want to set it to maybe the native, would be like 100 in most cases. Sometimes it's 200 or 400, but you just go as low as possible. Just take your ISO all the way down and you won't get any noise in your image. Second of all, you want to be adjusting your shutter speed, because if you shoot handheld, it's pretty important that you have that one above 1/60th of a second. So if it's daytime outside, just go with 1/200th of a second. Then you want to be adjusting your aperture, and obviously the last thing to adjust will always determine how the image will be exposed. So if it's a dark scene, you can open up the aperture and it will give you a lot of light. Or you can have a bright scene, you want to close it all the way down and maybe even go a lot higher with the shutter speed as well. So yeah, always just change the settings. Most often you don't have to change the ISO, but always change the settings depending on what you want to shoot. So that was the long version of me talking about the basics of photography. It's pretty important to know all these factors, because if you shoot manual photo, you pretty much can shoot manual video, which I'll be talking about in the future videos. Yeah, this will give me a better starting point. I can always refer to this video and say, hey, listen to what I say here. All right, I'll see you next video.